What if I told you that right now you're living in an ice age? Not kidding. According to glaciologists, an ice age is any time when massive ice sheets cover both poles. And well, Antarctica and Greenland still have those boxes checked, but that's not what people think of when they hear ice age. They think mammoths, saber-toothed cats, caves filled with giant bears. And fair enough, that's the exciting stuff. But here's what blows my mind. For most of Earth's history, there wasn't any ice at all. Zero. The whole planet was green, warm, and absolutely packed with life you wouldn't believe existed. So, when was the last time Earth looked like that? When could you stand at the South Pole without freezing to death? When did crocodiles sunbathe in Antarctica? The answer takes us back way farther than you'd think. We're not talking a few million years. We're going back to a time before humans, before any great apes existed, before North America and Europe were even separate continents. We're travelling to the late Eocene epoch, which ran from about 40 million to 34 million years ago. And this wasn't just a slightly warmer version of today. This was a completely different planet. Let me paint you a picture. It's 36 million years ago, and you're standing on a beach, not in the tropics, but in Antarctica. Yes, Antarctica. And instead of ice sheets stretching to the horizon, you're surrounded by palm trees. The air is warm, maybe around 27 degrees Celsius, and it's humid. You can hear waves lapping against the shore, and if you look out to sea, you might spot dolphins playing in the surf. Turn around, and behind you are dense forests climbing up into misty hills. This isn't science fiction. This is what Antarctica actually looked like during the late Eocene. The whole planet was like this. In places that are frozen tundra today, you'd find subtropical forests. France felt more like modern-day Syria. Alaska had palm trees. The Sahara Desert, it was covered in water, a shallow tropical sea teeming with life. And speaking of water, there was a lot more of it sloshing around. See, today about 70% of Earth's fresh water is locked up in ice. That's roughly 2% of all water on the planet. Doesn't sound like much, but when you melt all that ice and dump it into the oceans, sea levels rise dramatically. During the late Eocene, sea levels were possibly 70 meters higher than today. That's 230 feet. Entire coastlines were underwater. Florida completely submerged. Europe was carved up into a scattered archipelago of islands. The map of Earth looked nothing like what we know. And the temperatures. Studies show that before the Ice Age kicked off, average global temperatures were about 5 to 8 degrees Celsius hotter than today. That doesn't sound like much until you realise what it means. No temperature gradient from equator to poles. The Arctic Circle was warm enough for palm trees. Antarctica had forests of southern beech trees and probably supported all kinds of animal life we're still discovering. The climate was so stable that there were no real seasons in many places. No winter, no summer, just endless warm, humid days. But what made this warm world truly remarkable was the weather it created. With all that heat and moisture, you got some seriously intense storms. Massive hurricanes that would make modern Category 5 storms look tame. Wildfires that raged across vast stretches of forest. And the rain, when it came hard. But there were also droughts because the climate patterns were totally different from today. The whole system was just pumping energy around in ways we can barely imagine. Now here's where things get interesting. All that warmth and all that water created perfect conditions for some of the most bizarre and terrifying predators Earth has ever known. And I'm not talking about dinosaurs. Those were long gone by this point. I'm talking about mammals and reptiles that evolved in this greenhouse world to become absolute monsters. Let's start in the oceans. During the late Eocene, the top predator wasn't a shark, wasn't a crocodile, it was a whale, but not the gentle giants we know today. These whales were the complete opposite. They were apex predators with teeth designed to kill, and they had a name that sounds more dinosaur than mammal, Basilosaurus. Now, Basilosaurus literally means king lizard, which is hilarious because it's not a lizard at all. When scientists first found the bones in the 1800s, they thought they'd discovered some kind of massive sea serpent. Turned out it was a whale, but what a whale. These things grew up to 18 meters long, about 60 feet. Think humpback whale, but sleeker, faster, and with a mouth full of nightmares. The teeth alone tell you everything. Basilosaurus had dozens of them, and they came in different types. Some were sharp for piercing, others were thick and robust for crushing. And here's the kicker, they could chew their food. Modern whales either filter feed or swallow prey whole. Basilosaurus tore its victims apart and ground them into paste. Studies on fossilized Basilosaurus skulls show they could deliver a bite force of about 16,400 newtons. That's enough to shatter concrete under the right conditions, and they aimed for the skull when hunting. What did they hunt? Pretty much anything they wanted. Sharks, large fish, and other whales. Yeah, you heard that right. Basilosaurus ate other whales. We know this because paleontologists have found bite marks on the skulls of a smaller whale called Dorudon, juvenile Dorudon to be specific. The bite marks match Basilosaurus teeth perfectly. These predatory whales were hunting in calving grounds, going after whale babies like orcas do today. Stomach contents found in fossilized Basilosaurus confirm it. One specimen had the remains of at least one young Dorudon and a large fish called Pycnodus macatamensis inside it. And Basilosaurus wasn't picky about where it hunted. Fossils have been found on every continent, Antarctica included. They lived in open oceans, shallow inland seas, even brackish marshes and mangrove forests. If there was salt water, there was probably a Basilosaurus nearby. The Sahara Desert, which was underwater back then, has Basilosaurus fossils. They were everywhere. But wait, there's more. Basilosaurus wasn't the only nightmare in the water. There was another basilosaurid that was even bigger, though thankfully less aggressive. Perucetus. Early estimates for this chunker put it at 340 tons, which would make it the heaviest animal ever. Those estimates turned out to be way too high, but Perucetus was still massive, probably somewhere between 35 and 50 tons, and it was only 20 meters long. That means it was built like a whale-shaped tank, so heavy and thick that it probably couldn't move very well. Scientists think it spent most of its life in shallow water, feeding on bottom-dwelling creatures instead of actively hunting. Still, imagine running into that thing in murky water. And then you had sharks. Of course you had sharks. One genus in particular should sound familiar. Otodus. That's the same lineage that eventually gave us Megalodon. But during the late Eocene, Megalodon hadn't evolved yet. Instead, you had Otodus auriculatus, a species that could grow to 9.5 meters long. That's 31 feet, about the size of the largest killer whales on record. And this thing was an apex predator with a giant mouth and serrated teeth that could shred prey into ribbons. Fossils have been found in Europe, North America, Asia, and Antarctica, and there's evidence of an even bigger species, Otodus obliquus, which might have reached 12 meters or 39 feet, more comparable to a large whale shark than a killer whale. So you've got giant predatory whales versus giant sharks, both roaming the same oceans. It's not hard to imagine them clashing from time to time. The ocean during the late Eocene was not a safe place, but if you thought the whales and sharks were bad, wait until you hear about the snakes. During the late Eocene, the oceans were home to some of the largest serpents that ever existed. And I'm not exaggerating, these were sea snakes that make today's versions look like garden hoses. The family is called Paleophiidae, and they were giants. The two biggest species were Pterosphenus and Paleophis. Pterosphenus could reach lengths of 5.7 meters or 19 feet. That's already bigger than most snakes alive today, but Pterosphenus was tiny compared to its relative Paleophis colosseus. This absolute unit could grow to 12.3 meters long. That's over 40 feet. To put that in perspective, the largest sea snake alive today is maybe 3 meters. Paleophis colosseus was 4 times longer. And despite their size, these snakes weren't slow. They had compressed tails that worked like flukes, letting them undulate through the water with scary efficiency. But here's what's unsettling. They were way more robust and powerfully built than modern sea snakes. Paleontologists think they relied on ambush tactics, hiding and then striking with remarkably powerful jaws. Their mouths were hyperflexible, meaning they could swallow large prey whole, sharks, big fish, possibly even small whales. The warm temperatures of the late Eocene let these cold-blooded reptiles spread globally, living in areas that would be way too cold for them today. Between the whales, the sharks, and the sea serpents, the oceans of the late Eocene were basically a horror show, but at least there were some friendlier creatures around. Sea turtles, cephalopods, bony fish, invertebrates, and sirenians, the group that includes modern manatees and dugongs. During the Eocene, sirenians were exceptionally diverse and weird. Some of them still had 4 limbs and fingers. A few species were amphibious, splitting their time between water and land. There's even evidence that some were primarily terrestrial, walking around on land like their ancestors. Evolution was still figuring out what to do with these guys. And get this, whales were on land too. Well, sort of. Alongside the terrifying Basilosaurus, there was another family of whales called protocetids. These were amphibious whales with strong limbs that could support their weight on land. They also had webbed feet, and some had well-developed tails for swimming. But unlike modern whales, protocetids had teeth designed for eating meat, sharp teeth for piercing and shearing flesh. The good news is they weren't as big as Basilosaurus. They were more bear-sized, with the largest being about as heavy as a grizzly. The bad news is they could chase you on land. Yeah, you could be killed by a whale in the Sahara and then chased by another whale on the beach, not something you'd expect from your typical ice-free Earth scenario. Now, all of this was happening in the oceans and along the coasts, but what about on land? What was the surface of iceless Earth like? Completely different, thanks to the warmer, more humid climate. Tropical forests dominated. You'd find them stretching across areas that are deserts or grasslands today. Open woodlands and deciduous forests filled in the rest. And because Earth had time to recover from the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs, animals were getting big again, really big. One group in particular was crushing it in the large mammal department, the ungulates, or hoofed animals. These are the ancestors of horses, rhinos, and giraffes, and during the Eocene, they were evolving into some truly massive creatures. One family, the Brontotheres, became some of the first land mammals to weigh multiple tons. Brontotheres looked a lot like rhinos superficially, with thick bodies and bony horns. But those horns weren't made of keratin like rhino horns. They were straight up bone. Some species had elaborate horn structures, and scientists think they used them for head clashing during mating competition. The largest Brontotheres weighed over 4 tons, about the size of a small elephant, and they were everywhere on the surface, one of the most common sights you'd see. Then you had another group doing the rhino body plan, the embrithopods. These guys looked like rhinos too, but they were actually more closely related to sirenians, if you can believe that. And they were even bigger than Brontotheres. Some species weighed more than 4.5 tons, which is similar to a small adult Asian elephant. Between Brontotheres and embrithopods, if you wanted to see a multi-ton herbivore that looked vaguely like a rhino, the late Eocene had you covered. And then there were the early proboscideans, the ancestors of elephants. They were undergoing their own growth spurt during this time, though they weren't the giants we know today. Some were barely shoulder height on a human, but give them a few million more years, and they'd become the behemoths we associate with the name. Primates were thriving too, way more diverse than today, actually. The warmer climate meant more forests, and more forests meant more monkeys. We didn't have any super intelligent apes yet, but primates were doing just fine without us, thank you very much. And rodents, lots and lots of rodents, insectivores, small-hoofed mammals with odd numbers of toes. It was a boom time for mammals in general, with diversity exploding in every direction. But mammals weren't the only game in town. Reptiles were making a serious comeback. Remember, the Cenozoic is supposed to be the age of mammals, but during the Eocene, reptiles were putting up a hell of a fight, and the warm temperatures gave them a major advantage. Most reptiles are cold-blooded, so the greenhouse climate was like a power-up. They didn't bother with the role of large herbivores. Instead, they evolved into highly successful carnivores. And in some regions, they became the apex predators. The most notorious were the terror birds, Phorus racids, flightless killer birds with massive beaks that could grow taller than a human, but the birds, scary as they were, weren't the main threat. The real danger came from a family of terrestrial crocodilians, the Sebasidae. These weren't your typical crocodiles lounging in rivers. Sebasids were land predators. They had long legs positioned directly under their bodies, kind of like dinosaurs, and they could run. Their teeth were laterally compressed, pointed and serrated, more like a theropod dinosaur than a modern croc. These teeth alone made them incredibly dangerous, but just for fun, evolution also made them absolutely enormous. In South America, you had Barynosuchus. This beast had a maximum estimated size of 10 meters long, about 33 feet, with a weight of around 2 tons. That's bigger than any living terrestrial predator today. In fact, Barynosuchus might have been the largest land carnivore since the dinosaurs. And it wasn't alone. Over in Europe and North Africa, you had Dentaneosuchus, which was slightly smaller at 4 meters and 1 ton. Still massive. Still the largest predator Europe had seen in the Cenozoic, and paleontologists think these sebasids were robust enough to take down prey larger than themselves. So even in the age of mammals, reptiles were still very much in the game, and that sets up one of the most interesting dynamics of the late Eocene. Mammals and reptiles were basically competing for dominance. It's the closest Earth has come to a split kingdom since the dinosaurs died out. And that brings us to the end of episode 1. We've seen an Earth without ice, palm trees in Antarctica, 70-meter higher sea levels, predatory whales eating other whales, giant sea snakes lurking in tropical seas, multi-ton rhino-like mammals roaming forests, and land crocodiles the size of dinosaurs hunting anything they could catch. But there's one question we haven't answered yet. If Earth was this warm, this stable, this full of life, what changed? What brought the ice back? And when it did, what happened to all these incredible creatures? That's what we're diving into next. 34 million years ago, something went catastrophically wrong for life on Earth, and it all started with one continent deciding it didn't like its neighbour anymore. Antarctica broke up with Australia. Yeah, I know that sounds ridiculous, but continental drift is a slow-motion disaster movie, and this particular breakup changed everything. See, for millions of years, Antarctica had been slowly drifting southward, still connected to Australia through a land bridge. But around 34 million years ago, that connection finally snapped. Australia drifted north, leaving Antarctica isolated at the South Pole. And that created a problem. With Antarctica now sitting alone at the bottom of the world, ocean currents could flow all the way around it for the first time. This created what's called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, or ACC, and this current is an absolute beast. It's basically a river of freezing water encircling the entire continent, blocking warm water from ever reaching Antarctica. The ACC also absorbs massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which creates a feedback loop. Less carbon dioxide means lower temperatures. Lower temperatures mean more ice. More ice means even lower temperatures, and on and on. The result? Antarctica, which had been covered in lush forests for millions of years, started to freeze. Scientists studying sediment cores from around Antarctica can pinpoint the exact moment when everything changed. Before 34 million years ago, the cores show pollen from diverse plant life, evidence of a warm landscape with forests and tundra vegetation. Then, right at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, you start seeing dropstones. These are small rocks sitting in seafloor mud, which means icebergs were floating overhead, dropping debris as they melted. The plant fossils shift too, becoming more Arctic-like, similar to what you'd see in northern Canada or Russia today. And in some cores you find diamics, which are sediments deposited directly by glaciers. All of this points to one conclusion: ice sheets had arrived. And not small ice sheets either. Within about 700,000 years, Antarctica went from mostly ice-free to covered by a continental-scale ice sheet. The East Antarctic ice sheet grew to roughly its modern size almost overnight in geological terms. This caused global sea levels to drop by about 70 meters. That's 230 feet. Coastlines that had been underwater for millions of years suddenly became dry land. Shallow seaways connecting continents dried up, creating new land bridges, and the climate everywhere, not just Antarctica, got colder. How much colder? Well, studies from North America show temperatures dropped by 7 to 11 degrees Celsius in the earliest Oligocene, that's 13 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it happened fast, over maybe 400,000 years. Annual rainfall, which had been over a meter in the late Eocene, dropped to less than half that. The world was drying out and cooling down at the same time. Carbon dioxide levels tell the same story. At the start of the Eocene-Oligocene transition, atmospheric CO2 was around 885 parts per million. By the time the ice sheets had fully formed, it had dropped to about 560 parts per million. And here's the scary part for us living today. Scientists estimate that the threshold for permanent Antarctic ice is somewhere between 600 and 750 parts per million. Once CO2 drops below that, the ice sheets grow. When it rises above that, they start to melt. And right now, in our modern world, we're at around 420 parts per million and climbing fast. But that's a story for another time. The point is, this wasn't a gradual change. It was a climate catastrophe, and it rewrote the entire biosphere. Forests started to die back, replaced by grasslands and cool savannas. Animals adapted for running and grazing suddenly had an advantage. Anything that loved warm weather was in deep trouble, and extinctions started piling up. So many animals went extinct during the Eocene-Oligocene transition that scientists now classify it as a minor mass extinction event. It's even got a name in Europe, the Grande Coupure, the Great Break. because the fossil record literally shows a massive break in continuity, with whole groups of animals disappearing and new ones taking their place. Who died out? Well, the basilosaurids were wiped out completely, those terrifying predatory whales that dominated Eocene oceans, gone. Every single species, Brontotheres, extinct, those multi-ton rhino-like mammals that had been thriving for millions of years. They couldn't adapt to the new climate. Many early primates went extinct too, and reptiles got absolutely hammered. The warm temperatures had been their advantage, and when that disappeared, they either died out or saw their ranges shrink dramatically. Even the survivors were limited to equatorial regions where it was still warm enough. But not everything died. Some groups made it through, and interestingly, it was around this time that many modern lineages of mammals got their start. The Oligocene saw the rise of early cats, dogs, bears, and other carnivores we'd recognize today. Their behavior changed too. Colder temperatures led to adaptations like thicker fur, hibernation, seasonal breeding, and migration. These are all responses to living in a world with actual winters again. Now, one thing I haven't told you yet is what else was happening in the oceans during the late Eocene, because while Basilosaurus was out there eating other whales, there were other predators doing their own thing, smaller ones, weirder ones, and some that barely survived the transition. Take the early cetaceans that weren't basilosaurids. You had Cynthia cetus, a mid-sized whale that coexisted with Basilosaurus in the same waters, and Basiloterus, another predator competing for the same prey. The oceans were crowded with different whale species, all carving out their own niches. Some ate fish exclusively, others hunted marine mammals. A few probably scavenged, but when the climate shifted and the ice came, most of them couldn't adapt. Only a handful of whale lineages made it through to the Oligocene, and those survivors eventually gave rise to all modern whales and dolphins. The same thing happened with sirenians. Remember those weird early manatees and dugongs that still had legs and could walk on land? Most of them went extinct. The only ones that survived were the fully aquatic species that had committed entirely to life in the water. And even they took a major hit to their diversity. Today, we have only 5 living sirenian species, manatees and dugongs. That's it. During the Eocene, there were dozens. Sharks fared better, but even they saw changes. The Otodus lineage that I mentioned earlier, the ancestors of Megalodon, survived the extinction event, and in the cooler Oligocene oceans, they continued evolving. Eventually, millions of years later, they'd give rise to the largest shark that ever lived. But that's getting ahead of the story. One group that really struggled was the ancient sea snakes, those giant paleophytes like Paleophis and Pterosphenus. They went extinct, every single one of them. The warm tropical seas they depended on disappeared as the climate cooled, and they couldn't adapt fast enough. Modern sea snakes are a completely different lineage, much smaller and less specialized. The age of giant marine serpents ended at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. Now, let's talk about something I haven't covered yet, the strange transitional mammals that were still figuring out how to live, because the late Eocene wasn't just about giant predators and massive herbivores. There were also plenty of animals that were evolutionary experiments, dead ends. Weird offshoots that didn't quite work out. Take the Mesonychids. These were hoofed carnivores. Yes, hoofed. Imagine a wolf-sized predator with teeth like a hyena, but running on hooves instead of claws. They were around during the Eocene, filling carnivore roles in some ecosystems, but they were outcompeted by actual carnivores, the ancestors of modern dogs and cats, and went extinct. or the creodonts. These were the dominant carnivores of the early Cenozoic, including the Eocene. They looked vaguely like modern carnivores but weren't closely related. Some were small and weasel-like, others were huge, with massive heads and bone-crushing jaws. One family, Hyaenodontids, included species the size of lions. But creodonts were more primitive than true carnivores, and when the climate changed, they struggled to compete. Most went extinct during the Oligocene, though a few lineages hung on until the Miocene. Then you had the hell pigs, Entelodonts. These were not actually pigs, despite the name. They were omnivorous mammals with massive heads, powerful jaws, and a nasty temperament. Some species stood over 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed close to a ton. They had bony growths on their skulls that might have been used for fighting or display, and their teeth could handle just about anything, from plants to meat to bones. Hell pigs survived the Eocene-Oligocene transition and actually thrived in the cooler Oligocene, becoming one of the dominant large predators in North America and Asia, but eventually they too went extinct, outcompeted by more efficient carnivores. What about the mammals that looked like they were trying to be dinosaurs? Oh yeah, those existed too. Chalicotheres were perissodactyls related to horses and rhinos, but instead of hooves, they had claws, giant claws. They walked on their knuckles like a gorilla, and probably used those claws to pull down branches for feeding. Some paleontologists think they might have used the claws for defense too. Chalicotheres appeared in the Eocene and survived all the way to the Pleistocene, outlasting most of the other weird ungulates. And speaking of weird ungulates, let's talk about the Litopterns. These were South American mammals that evolved in isolation after South America split from other continents. Some Litopterns looked like horses, others looked like camels, but they weren't related to either group. It's a case of convergent evolution, where animals in similar environments evolve similar body plans. Litopterns thrived during the Eocene and Oligocene in South America, but when the Isthmus of Panama formed millions of years later and allowed North American animals to invade, they were doomed. Now, I mentioned terror birds earlier, but I didn't give them their due. Phorus racids were some of the most terrifying predators of the Cenozoic, and they deserve more attention. These birds were flightless, but they didn't need to fly. They could run fast, and they had massive hooked beaks that could deliver devastating strikes. The largest species stood over 3 meters tall and weighed several hundred kilograms. Their skulls were enormous relative to their body size, and their beaks were reinforced to handle the stress of killing large prey. Some paleontologists think they hunted in packs, though that's still debated. Terror birds appeared in the Paleocene and survived well into the Pliocene, with the last species going extinct only a couple million years ago. During the Eocene and Oligocene, they were apex predators in South America, competing with the giant crocodilians for dominance. Speaking of giant crocodilians, the sebasids I mentioned earlier weren't the only crocodilomorphs doing interesting things. You also had the Dirosaurids, a family of marine crocodiles that survived the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. These were long-snouted fish-eaters that lived in coastal waters and river estuaries. During the Eocene, Dirosaurids were still around, especially in South America and Africa, but they were on their way out. By the end of the Eocene, they went globally extinct, probably because the climate cooling disrupted their preferred habitats. And then there were the Mekosuchines. These were crocodilians that lived in Australia and nearby Pacific islands. They were incredibly diverse during the Eocene and Oligocene, with species ranging from small insectivores to large ambush predators. Some had deep skulls and blade-like teeth similar to the sebasids. Others were semi-aquatic generalists. Mecasuccinus survived all the way to the Holocene, with the last species going extinct only a few thousand years ago when humans arrived in the Pacific Islands, but their diversity peaked during the Eocene, when Australia's climate was warmer and wetter. Let's swing back to the marine world for a minute. I told you about the big predators, but what about everything else living in the oceans? The Eocene seas were packed with life at every level. You had ancient relatives of modern fish, massive rays, sawfish, coelacanths, and bony fish in bewildering variety. Some were tiny, others were huge, like Pycnodus, a fish with thick, rounded teeth for crushing mollusks. Pycnodus was one of the main prey items for Basilosaurus, and fossils of it have been found in Basilosaurus stomach contents. There were also ancient turtles. Some were giant, like Papygerus, a sea turtle that lived alongside Basilosaurus in the shallow seas of what's now the southeastern United States. And cephalopods, the group that includes modern octopuses and squids, were already diverse and successful. Coral reefs were thriving too, though they looked different from modern reefs. The corals themselves were related to modern species, but the overall ecosystem had a different structure, and shallow tropical seas supported vast beds of seagrass, which in turn supported huge populations of herbivorous fish and invertebrates. In deeper waters, you had things like ancient hagfish and lampreys, jawless fish that have barely changed in hundreds of millions of years. And then there were the foraminifera, tiny single-celled organisms that are absolutely critical for understanding past climates. Their shells preserve chemical signatures of ancient ocean temperatures, which is how we know so much about Eocene climate. When the Eocene-Oligocene transition happened, foraminifera in deep ocean environments underwent major turnovers, with species adapted to warm water going extinct and cold water species taking over. One last thing about the oceans. During the Eocene, ocean circulation was completely different from today. Without the Antarctic circumpolar current, warm water from the tropics could flow all the way to the poles. This meant that even deep ocean water was relatively warm. But when the ACC formed and Antarctica froze over, everything changed. Cold, dense water started sinking around Antarctica, creating deep ocean currents that flow northward and drive circulation patterns we still see today. This is called thermohaline circulation, and it's one of the main engines of Earth's climate system. The formation of Antarctic ice didn't just cool the surface, it fundamentally reorganized how the oceans move heat around the planet. And that reorganization had consequences on land too. With cooler oceans came changes in atmospheric circulation. Storm tracks shifted, rainfall patterns changed, monsoon systems intensified in some regions and weakened in others. Deserts started to expand. And all of this happened within a few 100,000 years, which is a blink of an eye in geological time. So by the end of the Eocene-Oligocene transition, Earth looked very different. Antarctica was covered in ice, sea levels had dropped, forests had given way to grasslands in many areas, entire groups of animals had gone extinct, and the survivors were adapting to a colder, drier, more seasonal world. But here's the thing, the transition wasn't smooth, it happened in steps. Scientists studying the oxygen isotope record, which tracks ice volume and temperature, have identified two major pulses. The first, called EOT1, occurred around 34.1 to 33.9 million years ago. Carbon dioxide dropped from about 885 parts per million to 560. That's when the initial ice sheet formed. Then there was a second pulse called OI1 around 33.55 million years ago. This was when the Antarctic ice sheet expanded to close to its modern size. Between these two pulses, the ice sheet was unstable, growing and shrinking with orbital variations. But after OI1, it stabilized and became permanent. And with that permanent ice, Earth entered a new era, the late Cenozoic Ice Age, which, by the way, we're still in. The ice that formed 34 million years ago never fully melted. It grew and shrank over the following millions of years, spreading to the northern hemisphere during the Pleistocene and retreating during interglacials, but it never went away completely. Which brings us back to the question, will the ice ever disappear again? Will Earth return to the green, ice-free state of the late Eocene? That's what we're exploring next. Here's something wild. During the warmest part of the Eocene, around 49 million years ago, there was an event called the Eocene climatic optimum, and optimal is definitely the word for it, at least if you were a heat-loving organism. Global temperatures peaked at their highest point for the entire Cenozoic era. We're talking average surface temperatures around 30 degrees Celsius. The poles were so warm that palm trees and alligators lived within the Arctic Circle, not near it. Inside it. And the carbon dioxide levels? Through the roof. Some estimates put atmospheric CO2 at around 4,000 parts per million during brief spikes. That's the highest concentration detected during the entire Eocene. For context, before the Industrial Revolution, CO2 was at about 280 parts per million. We're currently around 420 and rising. But 4,000, that's a different planet entirely. What caused these spikes? Scientists think it was a combination of factors, massive volcanic activity, especially from seafloor spreading between Australia and Antarctica, metamorphic reactions releasing carbon during the collision of India with Asia, which was forming the Himalayas, and possibly methane release from warming ocean sediments. Whatever the cause, it pumped greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a furious rate, driving temperatures even higher. And this created some truly bizarre conditions. Sea surface temperatures in tropical regions jumped to between 32 and 36 degrees Celsius. That's 90 to 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Ocean water that hot starts to affect marine life in weird ways. It becomes more acidic. It holds less oxygen. Deeper waters become dysoxic, meaning oxygen depleted, which stresses bottom-dwelling organisms. Carbonate accumulation in the deep ocean declined, probably due to ocean acidification. And populations of benthic foraminifera, those tiny organisms living on the seafloor, crashed. On land, lakes in North America suddenly became less salty, suggesting massive increases in rainfall, but this warmth was short-lived. By around 40 million years ago, temperatures started to cool again, and that cooling continued, slowly but steadily, for the next 6 million years, eventually culminating in the ice sheet formation we've already talked about. But before the ice arrived, there was still time for evolution to produce some absolutely bonkers animals. Let me tell you about a few that didn't make the cut in earlier episodes. First up, the Andrewsarchus. This thing was possibly the largest terrestrial carnivorous mammal ever, and I say possibly because we only have one skull. That's it, one skull found in Mongolia, and it's massive, over 83 centimeters long. Based on that skull and comparisons with related animals, paleontologists estimate that Andrewsarchus might have been nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed close to a ton. It belonged to a group called mesonychids, those weird hoofed predators I mentioned before. Its teeth suggest it was a meat eater, but it might have also scavenged or even eaten some plant material. We just don't know. What we do know is that during the Middle Eocene, there was something built like a wolf the size of a horse running around Asia, and that's terrifying. Then there's the Arsinoitherium. Picture a rhino. Now give it two enormous bony horns side by side on its snout. Not small horns, massive paired horns that could be over 1/2 meter long. Arsinoitherium lived in North Africa during the late Eocene and early Oligocene, in the swamps and rivers that covered the region. It was an embrythopod related to those rhino-looking mammals I talked about earlier, and it was huge. Some individuals weighed close to 3 tons. Despite its appearance, it was more closely related to elephants and sea cows than to actual rhinos. Evolution really loved the rhino body plan and kept independently inventing it. And speaking of elephants, let's talk about the early proboscideans in more detail. One genus, Moeritherium, lived in Egypt during the Eocene. It was semi-aquatic, about the size of a pig, and it had a short trunk, nothing like the massive trunks of modern elephants. Just a slightly elongated nose and upper lip. Its lifestyle was probably similar to a pygmy hippo, spending time in water and munching on aquatic plants. This was what the elephant lineage looked like before it went big. And it's amazing to think that this little swamp dweller eventually gave rise to animals weighing 6 tons. Another early elephant relative was Paleomastodon. This one lived slightly later in the Oligocene, but it's worth mentioning because it shows the next step in proboscidean evolution. Paleomastodon was bigger than Moeritherium, standing about 1.5 meters tall at the shoulder. It had a real trunk this time, and small tusks growing from both its upper and lower jaws, 4 tusks total. Over the next few million years, the lower tusks would disappear in most elephant lineages, but Paleomastodon kept them. Now let's talk about something I haven't touched on yet, the evolution of horses during the Eocene, because the famous Eohippus, the dawn horse, is only the beginning of the story, and that story gets weird. Eohippus, or Hyracotherium if you want the proper scientific name, was tiny, about the size of a fox or a small dog. It had 4 toes on its front feet and 3 on its hind feet, all with little hooves. It lived in forests, browsing on soft leaves and fruits. Its teeth were low-crowned and bumpy, not at all like modern horse teeth, and it had a small brain with especially small frontal lobes. Basically, it was a primitive little forest dweller that didn't look anything like a modern horse. But evolution got to work. During the Eocene, Eohippus gave rise to Orohippus, which had slightly more advanced teeth. The premolars started to look more like molars, increasing the grinding surface area. Then Orohippus evolved into Epihippus, which had even better grinding teeth with well-formed crests. These changes were driven by diet. As the climate shifted and vegetation became tougher, horses needed better teeth to process it. By the end of the Eocene and into the Oligocene, you get Mesohippus. This horse was bigger, about the size of a sheep, and it had only 3 toes on all 4 feet. The middle toe was larger and bore most of the weight, a step toward the single-hooved foot of modern horses. Mesohippus also had longer legs and a longer skull, both adaptations for living in more open environments. The forests were thinning, grasslands were expanding, and horses were evolving to keep up. But here's the kicker. Horses didn't evolve in a straight line from small to large, forest dwelling to plains running. There were side branches, dead ends, species that evolved in completely different directions. Some horses got bigger, others stayed small. Some developed high-crowned teeth for eating grass, others kept low-crowned teeth for browsing. Evolution isn't a ladder, it's a bush, and the horse family tree is one of the bushiest. Meanwhile, in South America, a completely different group of mammals was evolving in isolation, the Litopterns I mentioned earlier. One family, the Proterotheriidae, produced animals that looked almost exactly like horses. They had single-hooved feet, long legs, and grazing teeth. but they weren't horses. They weren't even close relatives. It's pure convergent evolution, proof that if you need to run fast on plains and eat grass, you're going to end up looking like a horse no matter what your ancestry is. South America also had its own unique brand of weirdness, notungulates. This was a huge group of hoofed mammals that diversified into dozens of forms. Some looked like rabbits, others looked like rhinos or hippos. One family, the Toxodontidae, produced animals the size of rhinos with barrel-shaped bodies and weird downward curving teeth. They survived until the Pleistocene, when humans likely hunted them to extinction. And then there were the marsupials. Everyone knows about Australian marsupials like kangaroos and koalas, but South America had its own marsupial radiation during the Cenozoic. Some were small and mouse-like, others were large predators. Thylacosmolus, which appeared later in the Miocene, was a saber-toothed marsupial that looked remarkably like a saber-toothed cat, right down to the huge canines. But it wasn't a cat, it was a marsupial. Again, convergent evolution. Okay. Back to the Eocene oceans for a minute, because I haven't told you about the early whales that led to Basilosaurus. The transition from land to sea is one of the most fascinating evolutionary stories we have, and the Eocene is when it really accelerated. The first whales back in the early Eocene were things like Pachycetus. This animal lived in freshwater rivers in what's now Pakistan. It was about the size of a wolf, with a long tail and 4 functional legs. It could walk on land, but spent a lot of time in water, probably hunting fish and other aquatic prey. Its ears had some modifications for underwater hearing, but it was far from fully aquatic. Then you get Ambulocetus, the walking whale. This thing was more committed to water. It had webbed feet, a powerful tail, and a crocodile-like body plan. It probably swam like a modern otter, using its hind legs and tail for propulsion, but it could still walk on land when needed. Ambulocetus is the perfect example of a transitional form, an animal caught between two worlds. Next came the Protocetidae, the family I mentioned earlier. These whales had even better adaptations for swimming, with shorter legs and more streamlined bodies, but they kept their legs functional and likely hauled out on land to rest or give birth. Some genera, like Rhodocetus, show evidence of a tail fluke developing, a major step toward full aquatic life. And then you get the Basilosauridae, which includes Basilosaurus and its relatives. By this point, the hind limbs were tiny and useless, just little vestigial bones embedded in the body wall. The tail had a full fluke. The nostrils had migrated halfway up the skull, though not all the way to the top like in modern whales, and the entire skeleton was optimized for swimming, with elongated vertebrae giving Basilosaurus that serpentine appearance. But even Basilosaurus wasn't the final form. After the Eocene, whales continued evolving. The Oligocene saw the appearance of early toothed whales and baleen whales, the two groups that dominate today. Toothed whales, or Odontocetes, developed echolocation, a biosonar system that lets them hunt in total darkness. Baleen whales, or Mysticetes, evolved filter-feeding structures and grew to enormous sizes. The blue whale, the largest animal ever, is a mysticete. And all of this, every single modern whale descended from those early Eocene experiments, from Pachycetus, a wolf-sized animal wading in rivers, to the blue whale, a 100-ton giant cruising the open ocean. That transformation took less than 50 million years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms. Now, I mentioned earlier that grasslands started expanding during the Oligocene, but I didn't explain why this was such a big deal, so let's talk about grass. grass is weird. It's a type of flowering plant, but it's incredibly tough. The leaves have tiny silica crystals in them, which makes them abrasive and hard to digest. Most herbivores can't eat grass without specialized teeth. That's why horses evolved high-crowned teeth. That's why ruminants like cows evolved complex stomachs to ferment grass and extract nutrients. Grass is basically plant armor, and it takes serious adaptation to overcome it. But grass has one huge advantage. It grows from the base, not the tip. So when an animal eats it, or a fire burns it, or a drought dries it out, the plant can quickly regrow. This makes grasslands incredibly resilient. And during the Oligocene, as the climate cooled and dried, grasslands started taking over areas that had been forests. Animals that could exploit this new food source thrived. Animals that couldn't went extinct. This was the beginning of the age of grasslands, which would dominate the Miocene and Pliocene. Horses, rhinos, camels, deer, antelope, elephants, all of these groups diversified and spread across the expanding grasslands, and predators followed: lions, cheetahs, hyenas, wolves. The ecosystems we associate with African savannas or North American prairies, they all got their start in the Oligocene. And humans, we're grassland animals too. Our ancestors came down from the trees and adapted to life on the savannas. We evolved to run long distances across open ground, to throw projectiles accurately, to cooperate in hunts. All of that is tied to grasslands. So in a weird way, the Ice Age that started 34 million years ago set the stage for us. But let's zoom out for a second and think about what all this means. Earth had been ice-free, or mostly ice-free, for millions of years. Temperatures were stable, sea levels were high, life was thriving in the greenhouse climate. And then, relatively suddenly, everything changed. Ice sheets formed, temperatures dropped, sea levels fell, entire ecosystems collapsed. And it was all driven by carbon dioxide. When CO2 levels fell below a certain threshold, Antarctica froze, and once the ice was there, it created feedbacks that made the cooling worse. The ice reflected sunlight back into space, lowering temperatures further. The Antarctic circumpolar current blocked warm water from reaching the continent. Carbon dioxide continued to drop as the oceans absorbed it. This wasn't a random event. It was a tipping point, a point of no return where the climate system flipped from one stable state to another, and it happened because of slow, gradual changes that accumulated over millions of years until they crossed a critical threshold. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Are we approaching another tipping point? Just in the opposite direction? That's next. Let's talk about what's happening right now, because the story of Iceless Earth isn't just ancient history, it's a preview of our possible future. Remember those CO2 thresholds I mentioned, the ones where Antarctic ice becomes unstable? Scientists studying the Eocene-Oligocene transition found that permanent ice sheets don't form until atmospheric carbon dioxide drops below around 750 parts per million. Above that threshold, Antarctica is too warm to hold ice year-round. Below it, ice sheets grow and stabilize. And here's where it gets concerning. We're currently at about 420 parts per million and climbing. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was 280. We've added 140 parts per million in just 200 years. And if current trends continue, we could hit 600 parts per million by the end of this century. 750? That's potentially on the table for the 22nd or 23rd century. Now, that doesn't mean Antarctica will melt overnight. The ice sheet took hundreds of thousands of years to form. It'll take time to melt too. But here's the thing about tipping points. Once you cross them, the process becomes self-reinforcing. The ice starts melting. That reveals darker land or ocean underneath. Dark surfaces absorb more heat than white ice, which causes more warming, which melts more ice. It's a runaway feedback loop. And we're already seeing signs of it. The West Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass. Parts of the Greenland ice sheet are melting faster than predicted. Sea levels are rising, not dramatically yet, but measurably, about 3.4 millimeters per year on average. That doesn't sound like much until you multiply it out. Over a century, that's 34 centimeters. Add in thermal expansion of the oceans as they warm, and you're looking at potentially a meter or more of sea level rise by 2100. But if we keep pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and cross those critical thresholds, we're not talking meters, we're talking tens of meters, maybe even 70 meters, the same sea level rise that happened when the ice formed 34 million years ago, just in reverse. 70 meters is 230 feet. That would submerge every coastal city on Earth. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Shanghai, all gone. Florida completely underwater, just like during the Eocene. The Netherlands would disappear. Bangladesh would be mostly submerged. Hundreds of millions of people would be displaced, maybe over 1 billion. And it wouldn't just be sea level rise, the climate would change dramatically. Remember those intense storms and wildfires I described from the Eocene? Those come back too. Hurricanes get stronger, droughts get more severe, heat waves become deadly. The jet stream, which controls weather patterns in the northern hemisphere, becomes unstable, and all the ecosystems that evolved to survive in our current ice age climate, they'd have to adapt or die. Now, I'm not saying this will definitely happen. Climate is complicated, there are negative feedbacks as well as positive ones, but the paleoclimate record gives us a roadmap. It shows us what Earth looks like at different CO2 levels, and the message is clear. If we push carbon dioxide high enough, the ice goes away, and when the ice goes away, everything changes. Let's talk about timescales, because this is where things get tricky. Geologically, the Eocene-Oligocene transition was fast, 700,000 years to go from greenhouse to icehouse, but that's still a long time from a human perspective, 25,000 generations. Nobody alive during the beginning of the transition would have noticed anything. The changes were too slow. But modern climate change is different. We're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a rate that's probably faster than anything in the geological record, at least since the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. And that speed matters. When climate changes slowly, species can adapt or migrate. When it changes fast, they go extinct. There's a term for what we're doing. It's called the Anthropocene, the age of humans, and we're running a global experiment to see what happens when you rapidly pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere after millions of years of ice age climate. The results so far aren't great. Global temperatures are up about 1.2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. Arctic sea ice is shrinking. Glaciers are retreating worldwide. Ocean acidity is increasing. Coral reefs are bleaching. Species are going extinct at rates not seen since the end of the dinosaurs. And this is just the beginning. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions tomorrow, which we won't, the climate would keep changing for decades. Carbon dioxide lingers in the atmosphere for centuries. The oceans take time to warm up. Ice sheets have inertia. We've already committed ourselves to a certain amount of warming just from what we've already emitted. So what does this mean for the future? Well, let's game it out. Let's say carbon emissions peak around mid-century and then decline as renewable energy takes over. This is a relatively optimistic scenario. In that case, we might stabilize at around 500 or 600 parts per million CO2. Global temperatures would be 2 to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Sea levels would rise, but maybe only a metre or two over the next few centuries. Ecosystems would shift. Some species would go extinct, but it wouldn't be catastrophic. Humanity would adapt. Now let's say we don't get our act together. Emissions keep rising. We hit 1,000 parts per million by 2200. Temperatures go up 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. This is a very different world. Most tropical regions become uninhabitable during summer. Temperate zones shift toward the poles. The Amazon rainforest collapses and becomes savanna. Permafrost melts, releasing massive amounts of methane and carbon dioxide, creating even more warming. And the ice sheets start seriously melting, not quickly, but irreversibly. Over the next 1,000 years, we could lose most of Greenland and West Antarctica. Sea levels rise 10, 20, maybe 30 meters. And if we really screw up, if we burn all the fossil fuels and hit 1,500 or 2,000 parts per million, we're talking about a return to Eocene conditions, full deglaciation, 70-meter sea level rise, tropical conditions extending to the Arctic Circle. A planet completely unlike the one human civilization developed on. Is that likely? Probably not. We'd have to work really hard to burn that much fossil fuel, and hopefully we'll switch to renewables before then. But the point is, it's possible. The physics allows it, and the geological record shows us what happens. Now, here's an interesting wrinkle. Some scientists argue that even without human interference, Earth might have naturally exited the Ice Age at some point. Ice ages don't last forever. Over Earth's 4.5 billion year history, there have been several major glaciations separated by long ice-free periods. The current Ice Age, which started 34 million years ago, is actually one of the shortest. The Carboniferous Ice Age lasted 300 million years. The Huronian glaciation lasted 300 million years. By comparison, our Ice Age is just getting started. But these ice ages end eventually, usually when tectonic activity releases enough carbon dioxide to warm the planet. Volcanoes, continental collisions, seafloor spreading, these processes pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere over millions of years, and eventually the ice melts. In our case, without human interference, that might have taken another 50 million years. Studies looking at Antarctica's drift pattern suggest that the continent won't move far enough north to escape polar cold for at least that long, and without plate tectonics moving Antarctica, the ice stays. But we're not waiting for plate tectonics. We're doing it ourselves. We're running the 50 million year experiment in a few centuries. And that brings up an ethical question. Do we have the right to change the planet this dramatically, to potentially commit future generations to a world without ice, a world with coastlines in completely different places, a world where the climate is fundamentally different from anything humans have experienced? These aren't easy questions, and I don't have the answers, but the geological record at least gives us perspective. It shows us that Earth has been much warmer before, that life survived, that ecosystems adapted, but it also shows us that transitions are hard, that extinctions happen, that once you cross certain thresholds, there's no going back on human timescales. Let's talk about what a deglaciated Earth would actually look like, because I've been vague about it. If Antarctica melts completely, sea levels rise about 60 meters from that alone. Add in Greenland, and you're at 70 to 75 meters total. That's assuming all the ice melts, which would take thousands of years, but let's imagine it happens. First, coastlines change dramatically, not just flooding of low-lying areas, but complete reshaping of continents. The Mediterranean Sea expands, the Baltic Sea grows, the Gulf of Mexico pushes far inland into what's now the southern United States. The Amazon basin becomes a massive inland sea. Much of coastal Asia goes underwater. Australia loses a significant chunk of its coastline, and islands, many of them, simply vanish. But it's not all bad news for geography. Some areas that are currently underwater would become more accessible. The continental shelves, which are submerged during ice ages, were exposed during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were 120 meters lower. If sea levels rise 70 meters, we're still well above those glacial lows, but the shape of the continents changes in interesting ways. Second, climate zones shift. With no ice at the poles, the temperature gradient from equator to pole becomes much shallower. This means weather patterns change, the jet streams weaken or disappear, hurricanes might form at higher latitudes, monsoons intensify in some regions, and the tropics, which are already hot, become even hotter. There's a limit to how hot the tropics can get before convection and cloud formation create a stabilizing feedback, but we're not entirely sure where that limit is. The Eocene suggests it's around 40 to 45 degrees Celsius for sea surface temperatures, but land temperatures could be much higher. Third, ecosystems reorganize. Forests move poleward, grasslands shift, deserts expand or contract depending on rainfall patterns, and species either adapt, migrate, or go extinct. The Eocene-Oligocene transition showed us that large-scale climate change drives mass extinctions. A reverse transition from icehouse back to greenhouse would likely do the same. Fourth, ocean circulation changes. Remember the thermohaline circulation I mentioned? That's driven by cold, dense water sinking around Antarctica and Greenland. If those ice sheets melt and stop producing cold water, the circulation weakens or shuts down. This has huge implications for climate because the oceans are the main way heat gets distributed around the planet. A shutdown of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, for example, could cause Europe to cool even as the rest of the planet warms. Weird, but possible. And fifth, human civilization adapts or collapses. If sea levels rise slowly over centuries, we can probably manage it. Build seawalls, relocate cities, move agriculture to new areas. But if it happens faster, or if we cross multiple tipping points at once, things get dicey. Food security becomes a problem. Water resources become stressed. Climate refugees number in the hundreds of millions. Political instability increases. Wars over resources become more likely. None of this is inevitable. We have choices. We can reduce emissions. We can adapt. We can innovate. But the geological record reminds us that Earth doesn't care about our choices. The physics of climate is indifferent. If we put enough CO2 in the atmosphere, the ice melts. If the ice melts, sea levels rise. If sea levels rise, coastlines flood. Cause and effect. And maybe that's the most important lesson from the Eocene. Climate change isn't just a human political issue. It's a planetary process that's been happening for billions of years. We're not causing climate change in an abstract sense. We're accelerating a natural process and pushing it in a direction that benefits us in the short term but might hurt us badly in the long term. The last time Earth was ice-free, mammals like us didn't exist. Our ancestors were small tree-dwelling primates. We survived the transition to the Ice Age by adapting. We developed bigger brains. We learned to use tools. We conquered fire. We spread across the planet. And all of that happened during an Ice Age. We're an Ice Age species. So what happens to Ice Age species when the ice goes away? That's the final question. So here we are, 5 episodes deep into the story of Iceless Earth, and we've covered a lot of ground. We've seen a planet that was green from pole to pole. We've met predatory whales that ate other whales, giant sea snakes, land crocodiles the size of dinosaurs, and weird transitional mammals that don't fit any modern category. We've watched Antarctica freeze over, triggering a mass extinction that reshaped life on Earth. And we've asked ourselves the uncomfortable question of whether we're heading back to that greenhouse world. But there's one thing I haven't fully addressed, the grand cycle, because Earth's climate doesn't just randomly flip between icehouse and greenhouse. There's a pattern, a rhythm that plays out over hundreds of millions of years, and understanding that rhythm tells us something profound about our planet and our place on it. Let's zoom way out. Over the last billion years, Earth has experienced several major ice ages. The Huronian glaciation around 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago. The Cryogenian glaciations around 720 to 635 million years ago, which might have frozen the entire planet in what's called snowball Earth events. The Andean-Saharan glaciation around 450 to 420 million years ago. The Karoo Ice Age around 360 to 260 million years ago, and our current late Cenozoic Ice Age, which started 34 million years ago. Between these ice ages are long greenhouse periods where the planet is mostly or entirely ice-free. The early Paleozoic was mostly warm. The Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs, was a greenhouse world. Most of the Cenozoic, up until 34 million years ago, was ice-free. And if you average it out, Earth spends more time without ice than with it. Ice ages are the exception, not the rule. So what causes these cycles? Why does Earth periodically freeze and then thaw? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a few main factors. First, plate tectonics. The movement of continents changes ocean circulation, creates or destroys mountain ranges, and affects how carbon dioxide cycles through the Earth system. When continents are clustered near the poles, ice can form. When they're all near the equator, ice can't accumulate. The configuration of continents also affects ocean currents, which distribute heat around the planet. Second, volcanic activity. Volcanoes release carbon dioxide. When volcanic activity is high, CO2 levels rise and the planet warms. When it's low, CO2 levels drop and the planet cools. The rate of seafloor spreading affects this too. Faster spreading means more underwater volcanoes, which means more CO2 release. Third, weathering. When mountains form, they create huge amounts of fresh rock surface that reacts with atmospheric CO2 and locks it away as carbonate minerals. This is called silicate weathering, and it's one of the main ways CO2 gets removed from the atmosphere over long timescales. The formation of the Himalayas, for example, probably contributed to the cooling that led to Antarctic glaciation. Fourth, biological processes. Plants pull CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. When forests expand, CO2 levels drop. When forests die back, CO2 levels rise. The evolution of land plants in the Devonian around 400 million years ago might have triggered a glaciation by removing so much CO2 from the atmosphere. And the burial of organic matter, which eventually becomes coal and oil, locks carbon away for millions of years. And fifth, orbital variations. Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't perfectly stable. It wobbles and shifts on timescales of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. These Milankovitch cycles affect how much sunlight hits different parts of the planet at different times of year, which can trigger or end ice ages. But orbital variations are the trigger, not the underlying cause. You need the right background conditions, low enough CO2, the right continental configuration before orbital variations can tip the system into glaciation. All of these factors interact in complex ways. It's not like there's a simple on-off switch for ice ages. It's more like a dimmer dial with multiple hands on it, all moving at different speeds and affecting each other. And occasionally, all the hands line up just right, and boom, ice age. The late Cenozoic Ice Age, the one we're in now, was set up by a perfect storm of conditions. Antarctica drifted to the South Pole. The Himalayas rose up and started weathering massive amounts of CO2. Ocean currents reorganized and atmospheric carbon dioxide dropped below the critical threshold. Once the ice started forming, feedbacks kicked in and locked the system into icehouse mode. But like all ice ages, this one won't last forever. Eventually, plate tectonics will rearrange the continents, volcanic activity will release enough CO2 to warm the planet, the ice will melt, and Earth will return to its default state, which is warm and ice-free. The question is, when? If we don't interfere, if we somehow manage to stabilize our carbon emissions and avoid pushing the system into runaway warming, the ice might last another 50 million years, maybe longer. Antarctica needs to drift far enough north that it's no longer sitting over the pole. That takes time. Lots of time. Current models suggest Antarctica won't move significantly for at least tens of millions of years. Greenland might melt sooner. It's not over the pole, it's at a high latitude that's just barely cold enough to hold ice. A small amount of warming could tip it over the edge, but even if Greenland melts, Antarctica might stay frozen. We could have a one ice sheet world, which is pretty unusual in Earth's history. On the other hand, if we do interfere, if we burn enough fossil fuels to push CO2 above 750 or 1,000 parts per million, the ice goes away much sooner, hundreds to thousands of years instead of millions. And once it's gone, it might not come back for a very long time. Ice ages require specific conditions to start. You need the continents in the right places. You need CO2 to drop low enough. If we melt the ice by raising CO2, and then that CO2 stays high for thousands of years, the ice can't reform even if the orbital conditions are favourable. So in a very real sense, we're making a choice. Do we keep the ice age going, or do we end it prematurely? Now you might be thinking, what's the big deal? Earth was fine without ice for most of its history. Life thrived during the Eocene. Why is it such a catastrophe if the ice melts? And you'd be right, sort of. Life would survive, ecosystems would adapt, new species would evolve. In 1 million years, Earth would be fine. But we don't have 1 million years. We have decades, maybe centuries. And on those timescales, rapid climate change is devastating. The difference between the natural end of an ice age and what we're doing is speed. Natural deglaciations take thousands of years. We're looking at potentially melting ice sheets in hundreds of years. That's orders of magnitude faster. And speed matters because it determines whether species can adapt or migrate fast enough to survive. During the Eocene-Oligocene transition, extinctions happened over hundreds of thousands of years. Basilosaurus didn't go extinct overnight. It declined gradually as the climate cooled and its habitat shrank. Eventually, it couldn't maintain viable populations and went extinct. But that process took time. Evolutionary time. If we melt the ice in a few centuries, there's no time for evolution, there's barely time for migration, and species that can't move fast enough go extinct. This is already happening. Polar bears are losing their habitat, coral reefs are bleaching, alpine species are being pushed up mountains until there's nowhere left to go. And this is with only 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming. Imagine 3 or 4 or 5 degrees. So, yes, Earth would be fine, life would be fine, but a lot of species currently alive wouldn't be fine, and that includes a lot of species we care about. Elephants, rhinos, tigers, whales, gorillas, maybe even us, depending on how bad it gets. And here's the thing that really gets me. We know this. We have the geological record. We can look back at past climate transitions and see what happened. We know what CO2 levels do to ice sheets. We know what temperature increases do to sea levels. We know what happens when climate changes too fast. We have all the information we need to make informed decisions. But knowledge doesn't automatically translate to action, because climate change is a slow-motion disaster. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps up on you, and it's really hard for humans, both individually and collectively, to respond to threats that unfold over decades or centuries. We're good at responding to immediate dangers. We're terrible at responding to long-term, gradual ones. The Eocene can teach us something here, because the animals living during the late Eocene didn't see the Ice Age coming. How could they? Climate was stable, life was good, there was no reason to think anything would change. And then it did, and the ones that couldn't adapt went extinct. We're smarter than Basilosaurus. We can see the future. We can model climate systems and predict outcomes. We can make choices that will affect the trajectory of the planet, but only if we actually make those choices. So what should we do? I'm not a policy expert. I'm just someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about deep time and Earth's climate history. But if I had to distill the lessons from the Eocene into actionable advice, it would be this. First, respect thresholds. Climate systems have tipping points. Once you cross them, you can't easily go back. The formation of Antarctic ice was a tipping point. The melting of Antarctic ice would be another one. We need to identify where those thresholds are and make damn sure we don't cross them. Second, think in geological time. Our political and economic systems operate on timescales of years or decades. Climate operates on timescales of centuries and millennia. We need to expand our time horizons and make decisions based on long-term outcomes, not just short-term gains. Third, learn from the past. The geological record is a library of climate experiments. Every ice age, every greenhouse period, every mass extinction is a lesson. We should be studying these events intensely and using them to inform our decisions. And fourth, have some humility. Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. Humans have been around for maybe 300,000. We're newcomers, and we're playing with systems that are vastly older and more complex than we are. We should approach this with caution and respect, not arrogance. Now, I want to end on a slightly more hopeful note, because for all the doom and gloom about climate change, there's also something kind of amazing about our situation. We're the first species in Earth's history that's aware of its own impact on the planet. We're the first species that can study past climates and predict future ones. We're the first species that has a choice about what kind of planet we want to live on. That's both a burden and an opportunity. A burden because it means we're responsible. We can't claim ignorance. We know what we're doing, but also an opportunity because it means we can change course, we can innovate, we can adapt, we can make conscious decisions about our future. And maybe, just maybe, we can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. We can keep the Ice Age going a little longer. We can preserve the climate that human civilization developed in. We can protect the species and ecosystems that exist today. Not forever, obviously. Eventually plate tectonics will have their way and Earth will warm again, but we can buy time, millions of years of time. Or we can choose the other path. We can end the Ice Age early. We can return Earth to an Eocene-like state, and we can see what happens when you compress millions of years of climate change into a few centuries. Either way, it's our choice. And that's what makes this moment in Earth's history so unique. For the first time, a single species gets to decide the planet's climate trajectory, not through some grand deliberate plan, but through the accumulated effect of billions of individual choices about energy, consumption, land use, and technology. Every time you turn on a light, drive a car, eat food that was shipped across the world, you're participating in this grand experiment. We all are, and the outcome isn't predetermined. It depends on what we do next. The Eocene shows us one possible future, a world without ice, a world that's warmer, wetter, and completely different from what we know, and it also shows us the transition, the extinctions, the reorganization of ecosystems, the reshaping of continents. Is that the future we want, or do we want something different? I don't know the answer, but I know we need to decide soon because climate has momentum. The choices we make in the next few decades will echo for centuries, maybe millennia, and once we cross certain thresholds, there's no going back on human timescales. So look at the geological record, learn from the Eocene, understand what iceless Earth was like, and then ask yourself, is that where we want to go? Because if it is, we're right on track, and if it isn't, we need to change course, fast. The last time Earth was fully green, there were no humans, no cities, no agriculture, no civilization, just forests, oceans, and animals trying to survive in a world without seasons. Next time, if there is a next time, we'll be here, and we'll have to live with the consequences of what we've done. That's the real lesson from the Eocene. Climate changes, life adapts, but transitions are hard, and the faster they happen, the harder they are. We're living through one right now, and unlike every other species in Earth's history, we actually understand what's happening. We can see the trajectory, we can predict the outcome. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's where the story of Iceless Earth becomes your story, because the future hasn't been written yet. The geological record can tell us where we've been, it can show us what's possible, but it can't tell us where we're going. That's up to us.